Stephen Hendry has a new book out, and he hopped on the line with Owen last week to have a chat. It's brilliant. Have a look.
Okay, so Me and the Table is the brand new book from Stephen Hendry. It's out now, and I'm delighted to say that Stephen himself joins us on the line. Stephen, good afternoon to you. How are things?
Very well, thanks. How are you?
Very well. So Me and the Table, it's quite an apt title for this book, I find, reading it, because it is a relationship that you have with a sport, a complicated relationship with the sport. And I often wonder how you do these days, post the height of your professional career, when you've had to, I don't know, perhaps wean yourself away from the table a small bit. How do you cope getting away from that obsession?
Well, I do miss the big occasions. I still miss, competing, playing at the Crucible, playing in the big events. I don't miss the hours and hours of practice on my own that I had to do. But yeah, the title, actually, I thought of it myself while I was actually doing the book, because I realised that basically, for most of my life, it was just me and a snooker table.
Yeah, it's interesting as well when you think about most individual sports people who've made it to the very top of their game, that their relationship with themselves, their own mind, and in your case, the cue and the table, is obviously quite an intimate one. But also, strangely, your relationship with other sports people is far more interesting than a lot of team players. Like the way you talk about rivals throughout your career and during the peak of your career is fascinating. You think quite a lot, from what I can sense from the book, about the minds of your opponents as well as your own mind.
Yeah, snooker at the top level is a highly psychological sport. Sometimes when you get to the final stages of the World Championship, sort of skill and talent kind of goes out the window, and it becomes psychological. It becomes who can play the best under pressure. And for me, playing against other players in finals, you would sense things from them. They would maybe, they would play a bit quicker. They would hit the ball a bit harder. They would, shuffle in their seats. They might sweat a bit more than they normally did. So yeah, it's all about noticing these little things in your opponents.
One of those opponents in particular who comes up quite a bit in the book and who's been a big feature of your career is Steve Davis. I wonder, is it fair to say that you had an obsession with Steve Davis, and in terms of the things that he did, the way he carried himself, his demeanour, the way he played?
Yeah, there's no doubt Steve Davis was a massive influence on my career. From the minute I turned professional, we organised, my manager Ian Doyle organised a 6-night tour of Scotland with him, where I basically got slaughtered every night, but learned so much from the man. And yeah, his targets, his achievements were my targets for my career. So I was kind of obsessed is maybe too strong a word, but certainly it was a massive influence.
Did it help you to have that sort of singular focus, that you could kind of personify the things you wanted to achieve? You could see somebody there who you wanted to emulate?
Very much so. I mean, if you take one thing, 7 world titles, when I won the 7th, to beat Steve's 6, obviously, you kind of think, well, where to now? Because there's no more, no one's won more than that. So you kind of unconsciously take your foot off the pedal, because it's very difficult to find targets that are not false, but kind of artificial, because they're not real. They haven't been set by someone else.
Yeah, so you were almost based on the idea of being the best around, and perhaps the idea of notching up the elusive 8, as it became known, was less significant than outdoing Steve Davis.
Yeah, very much so. I think even after I won the 7th, I think my press conference, I said if I don't win another title, I can't complain about my career. I've had a magnificent career. But so even saying those words means that you're saying to yourself, okay, there's nothing else I can do.
I'm interested in how Steve Davis viewed you at the start. I'm not sure if you've spoken too much about that. Do you think he had respect for you at the very start? Did he know how good you would become? I
don't think, as I say, when we did the 6-night tour of Scotland, I don't think he thought I was going to be a threat in the future. He could, I think he obviously seen I had talent, but whether I could go all the way to win major titles, I don't think he believed that at that time. I didn't actually beat Steve until a couple of years later, when I was 18, when I won my first ranking tournament. So I think possibly when I beat him in my first long frame match, I think it was in the UK Championship, round about I'd be 18 or 19. I think then he probably thought, this guy is going to be a pain for me.
When he wasn't really rating you at the start, how did you feel?
How did I feel?
Yeah.
To be honest, I wasn't really looking for respect. I was just trying to be as good as I could be. I was loving playing snooker. Even at 16, it was, because I was so young, the youngest to turn professional, it was still kind of like a hobby. Although I was doing it for a living, I still didn't have any idea, what was going to happen in the next 30 years.
Yeah, it's very true. It's kind of all ahead of you. There is this sort of sense that, I don't know, I'm not sure how strong your self-belief was at that time. Did you know that you would go on to, I guess, outdo Steve Davis, become the leader of the sport, the world champion consistently, and the consistent world number one in the 1990s? Of course, there is kind of a sense of a singular focus. You got to focus on the here and the now and each game as it comes, as the cliche goes. But did you kind of view at that time, even in those very early days when Steve Davis was beating you on that tour of Scotland, that you would one day be better than him?
I think when I was 16, I turned professional, and I did an interview with a Scottish newspaper, and I said I'd be world champion at 21. And you know, I believed that. Obviously my father and Ian Daw, my manager, were pumping these beliefs into me and giving me confidence. But certainly at 16, I had no idea or no belief then that I was going to go on and topple Steve Davis. Because in Scotland there was no history of any snooker players being successful. So there was nothing to sort of back it up what I was saying, but other than the self belief that I had in myself.
Yeah, what was your father and what was Ian saying to you at that time to give you that self-confidence?
Well, my dad was, even at the age of 13, 14, was telling people I was going to be world champion.
Right.
He believed in my talent. There was people around Scotland when I used to play junior tournaments and amateur tournaments would say to my dad, "Well, you know, your son's, you know, he's got some talent. You know, he could go a long way." But I think in myself, you don't really think to yourself, "Wow, I'm going to be the best player in the world someday."
Because quite often, what would happen in that situation is that a parent tries to protect their son from that due to the possibility of, say, an ego growing. But it sounds that even from an early age, you sort of had a natural grounding. You didn't quite believe too far ahead of yourself that this thing was going to explode. You still had that humility, but kind of a deep-rooted confidence at the same time.
Yeah, very much so, and I think that's very important for anyone, especially in an individual sport. You know, they want to set out as a career is if you've got a good family, strong family background to keep your feet in the ground, good management. You know, obviously Ian Doyle was a very influential figure, and he took over not only my career but my life basically. But I was never allowed to get big-headed. Even when I started winning the big prizes, I was never allowed to think I was too big for my boots. I was always kept firmly on the ground.
Did you talk much to your rivals at the time? Did they talk much to you when you started out? Was it very much a person who's on their own? It's a solo sport, so you're going to keep yourself to yourself and not give away anything personality-wise or otherwise behind the curtain, for example?
Well, it was one of the things. Obviously, Ian had obviously studied Barry Hearn and Steve Davis, and Steve Davis kept himself to himself. So obviously Ian said, "Well, we're going to go down that route. If we want to be the best, we're going to copy their way of doing things." But on the other side, I mean, I was 16, and most of my peers were like, you know, way older than me, so we didn't have much in common anyway. So yeah, it was pretty much just me, you know, my dad, my manager Ian, and the guy that was driving me around to the tournaments, because obviously at 16 I couldn't even drive.
Right. So Ian spotted the fact that Steve Davis, not that he was a recluse, but he sort of kept himself to himself when it came to speaking to his rivals, and basically said, "We'll copy that because this is what the best in the business is doing right now." That's very interesting. It's almost a studying of a successful mechanism and taking the very ideals of it and kind of imposing it on yourself.
Yeah, well, we wanted to take over from Steve and Barry Hearn as the dominant force in snooker. So we kind of like, you know, the idea behind it. I keep going back to the 6-night tour was to see how they worked, to learn from the best. And yeah, we very much sort of adopted the mantra of keeping yourself away from other players, because especially an individual sport, you know, you want to have some mystique. When the player meets you at the table, it should be the first time he meets you. If you get too familiar and you're going out for dinner, then perhaps they're not, you know, they get too, you know, they're too friendly and they're more comfortable when you meet on the snooker table.
Yeah, and saying that, I'm always interested in someone like you and your view of other sports and how they interact with one another. Like take golf, for example, and they've got quite a camaraderie on a lot of tours, although that's quite different because they don't have the head-to-head nature of snooker for the majority of their season anyway. But say if you take something like tennis, it always seemed on the outside looking in that, say, Nadal and Federer, when they went head-to-head, had quite a good relationship, quite a friendly relationship. But I suspect beyond that, from what we couldn't see, there was something a little bit more insidious there, that there was something more resembling a real rivalry and something close to a hatred between those people. I'm not sure what your take is on that from your experiences of being in a deep rivalry at the very top of sport. Do you buy the idea that two people at the very top of the game can be friends?
No, I don't think so. I think Steve Davis and I will only really become friends near the end of our careers, and obviously now we work together on TV. But in the beginning, no, we were never friends. You would say hello and speak if we had to go to Asia on a tour or whatever. Obviously, you'd be in the same plane, so you couldn't not speak to somebody. But it was only pleasantries. It wasn't real friendship. But obviously, I lived in Scotland as well, so I would only really see these people at tournaments. I would never see them away from snooker, so that obviously helped as well.
Yeah. When did you realise you were going to become the undisputed king of the sport for quite a prolonged period of time?
I think at 18, when I won that first ranking tournament, the Grand Prix, beating Steve Davis in the quarterfinal, I thought I can go on and win a lot more now. That first major victory sort of proved to yourself that you can do it. Although I didn't win the World Championship for another 3 years, that was the big stepping stone in my career.
Because the alteration then is quite significant, going from the pursuer to the pursued. It seemed that you dealt with that very, very easily. Being the winner, being the champion, being the number one was something that you were born to do and that you were very much at ease with.
I loved being the best player in the world. It was the greatest, obviously, period of my career. To be the target, I enjoyed that. Down the years of in different sports, you hear people saying, I'm always the target, and people always play well against me. It's tough. It's tougher to stay at the top. But I just loved it. I thrived on it.
Where did you learn that? Did it take time to get used to that, or was it just a natural thing that you were born with?
It came naturally. As I say, snooker was the only thing I was ever any good at. And obviously, you don't know how you're going to react until you get to number one. I got to number one at the age of 21, winning the semi-final, and then I went on and won the final of the World Championship, beating Jimmy in 1990. And immediately, I just, the next season you're being introduced as the world number one, the world champion, and as I say, I just thrived in it. It gave me a tremendous buzz and made me want to win even more.
You don't know, you say there, you don't know how you're going to react to being number one. It went quite well for you. You don't know how other people are going to react to you when you become the champ either. Talk to us about Alex Higgins and how your relationship with him changed after you ended up becoming the best.
Well, when I turned professional at 16, Alex Higgins was brilliant to me. He would all the time at tournaments, summon me to the practice table and give, I'd practice with him for an hour or two, and he'd obviously play with one of the geniuses of the game, and it would be for a 16-year-old. It was just amazing from from Scotland playing an amateur game to all of a sudden you're practicing with one of the biggest names in snooker. It was incredible. But then when I started to win more tournaments, I started to become the enemy where Alex was concerned. He obviously was at that time was the enemy with Steve Davis, because Steve Davis was winning everything. Because obviously Alex was the people's champion. Although he didn't win as many tournaments, he believed that he was almost bigger than snooker. So for someone else to win everything, and the attention was kind of taken away from Alex, he didn't like that.
Did he ever say anything to you that suggested that? Did he manage to keep his I guess, not his dislike for you, but his dislike for your position in terms of you being the best? Did he manage to keep that under wraps, or was it quite obvious that things had gone a little bit cold?
Oh yeah, I mean there was never anything subtle about Alex Higgins. You would know if he didn't like you would know about it. So whether it's saying things in the press or saying things to someone that he knows it would get back to you, or even matches, as I say in the book, matches when he'd shake your hand and abuse you, say things that obviously I can't say in this radio show. It was never subtle.
Do you now sympathise with Alex Higgins' view at that point? I guess you could sympathise with it a few years ago. The idea that perhaps the grip on the sport was loosened from his perspective. There was a hotshot kid. I'm sure that was probably how he viewed you coming along and becoming the greatest in the sport. Can you sympathise with his view there? Was it hard for you to sort of view that from nearing the end of your career?
Well, I mean, it was only one way. I mean, I had no animosity towards Alex at all. So I mean, later on in my career, I met Alex 2 or 3 times, and we were fine. We would chat, and I went to his funeral, which was obviously a very sad occasion, but incredible how he was the funeral, how the people came out from. It was amazing. So yeah, I mean, I've got enormous sympathy for Alex. Throughout his career, the problems he had.
Yeah. You mentioned the funeral there. You mentioned in the book about that funeral and a lack of attendance from current players, from more contemporary players at that funeral. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was very disappointed because I think without Alex Higgins, I don't think snooker would have got as quickly where it was, because he changed the face of snooker when he went on TV the first time. Before, you had the likes of the Reardons, the Mountjoys, the Griffithses, the Dennis Taylors, who were all great players in their time, but they were pretty boring to watch. And then Alex came on; it was a breath of fresh air, and he got the public into snooker, a younger audience. So I think without him, snooker might not have been where it is today.
Yeah, for sure. I'd agree with you there. One other thing I wanted to ask you about in terms of the 90s, in terms of your period of dominance, it's one thing scaling the mountain, but I would often say it's a much harder thing to actually stay there, to actually keep that hunger. You mentioned the personification of Steve Davis's six as a thing to actually guide you home and to keep that hunger up. Was there anything else? Was there anything about your personality that changed when you got to the summit that helped you to stay there?
I just love winning. I just love winning. It was just, sometimes I would win a tournament on a Sunday night and be practicing again the Monday morning for the next one. I was greedy for success, and I never ever settled. There's been lots of players in snooker down the years where they win one ranking tournament and you'll never hear from them again, because that's what they've set out to do, and they've won it, and then they're comfortable with just being a top player. I wouldn't be comfortable with that. I want to be the best. And it was probably the reason why the downfall was so hard, because I obviously had so much success.
We'll talk about that downfall in just a moment. I just wanted to ask you about that relationship with winning. And you say there, I love winning. Is it the process of just winning a game of snooker, or is it the process of being the best in the world? Like, can you still get that buzz today playing events that aren't the World Championships and winning events that aren't the World Championships? Or did it have to be the best in the world? Did it have to be this huge event that everybody in the world is watching for you to get that full drug of adrenaline from this winning sensation?
Yeah. When I was world number one, it was about proving why I was world number one. So it was about winning the big events, winning the Triple Crown events, the Masters, the UK, the World Championship, winning those over and over again to prove that I was miles in front of the other players. That's what pushed me on to keep winning.
When did you realise that your game had, to a certain extent, deserted you? I don't want to say your game, maybe mental elements of the game were starting to show a few cracks. And how tough was that?
Well, I mean, round about sort of 10, 12 years before, round about 2000, I started, playing shots. I had this weird feeling in my arm where I wasn't going through the ball properly, and obviously the term yips I've used in the book, and it's a term I don't like, but it's the only word that anyone's ever used for it. So I would play the odd shot, like I wouldn't play it properly, and I would feel horrible, and I'd think about that didn't feel nice, and then all of a sudden you would avoid playing that single shot again in case it happened again, and then it would creep into other shots, and until gradually by the end of it, it was like there was so many shots that I just didn't feel I could play properly, and so that when you couldn't play properly, then you start losing to people you shouldn't lose to, then your confidence goes, then the enjoyment and looking forward to competing just disappears.
Yeah, I would imagine, I've never experienced it, but I'd imagine it's an incredibly hard thing to describe. I've seen somebody describe the golf yips. I know you hate the word yips, but unfortunately we're kind of stuck for vocabulary here around this. But I've seen someone describe it as other people, what we would know it as a psychological issue, but what you as a professional sportsman would know as a neurological issue, that there's very little you can do in terms of changing your mindset to stop this deterioration from happening. Yeah,
I mean, it starts off, with a physical thing of playing the shot wrongly. You kind of decelerate when you go through the cue ball. Your right hand tightens a little bit. But then as soon as it's happened once, and because you're avoiding playing that shot again, then it becomes psychological. Then you can't get rid of it because it's in there. So then you would play like kind of shots to avoid playing certain shots. So then your whole game is based around playing a way that you're not comfortable playing.
I'd imagine there's just a general feeling of helplessness around that era when you just can't do anything about this.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. It's you're sitting in your chair and basically, when Tom, who ghost wrote my book, I basically said to him, I says, how would you like to write a book without using a certain letter, say an S or an A? It's like the same as that. It's like not being able to play certain shots for me was just it was very debilitating.
How's your game at the moment? Do you still feel that on a day-to-day basis when you take to the table? Does it still hold you back?
Well, I hardly play anymore. If I've got an exhibition, I'll maybe go in and play maybe 3 or 4 days for an hour or something like that. I can still play to obviously a decent standard. when I'm practicing on my own, everything's great. But yeah, I mean, it's still, even when I get on a table in exhibition, there'll be certain shots where the breaks will go on, and I won't be able to play it properly.
Yeah, like you mentioned in the book as well, a story about your cue breaking in 2003, which was widely reported at the time as well. Like, there's little mental elements throughout your career that I don't want to say contributed to it, but I'd imagine, say, something like your cue going missing or getting broken, apologies, in 2003 was a hugely significant mental barrier for you to overcome, and that this was the latest one in 2012. Did you have that belief that you might have finally overcome it?
No, not really, to be honest. I mean, obviously the cue, my original cue that I won all 7 world titles, that getting broken was a huge event, obviously, in my career to have to adapt to new cues. I mean, I tried probably half a dozen before I ended up with the cue I finished my career with. So yeah, I mean, for a snooker professional, a cue is such an important thing. It's not like tennis where they walk out with half a dozen rackets and they're all exactly the same. Having that cue that suits you is so important.
Yeah, for sure. Stephen Hendry, it's been great chatting to you. The book is called Me and the Table, and it's absolutely brilliant. Congratulations on it, and thanks a million for your time.
Thanks very much.
What happened to the cue?
It was in his luggage and it broke. Simple as that. Got it back from the airport, opened it up, and it was sliced perfectly. They couldn't fix it. They tried to it was every cue is handcrafted, he says. So it's almost like a wand in Harry Potter. Once you break your wand, you're doomed, and that was the same with his snooker cue. Doomed is probably a bit strong, because he kind of had a period of being okay, obviously, this century, nowhere near the 90s, but that was more to do with perhaps just kind of a deterioration due to age or something like that as well. But the cue was definitely a contributing factor. He just felt it was completely alien to him, everything. But a game of that sensitivity, like a cue change like that, is a drastic change.
Is that not a bit mad? Is that not like Samson and the hare? Surely they can precision engineer the exact same cue.
Apparently not.
Same weight.
Apparently not. Like, it was the feel of it as well. It was the exact texture, the exact shape of it, the exact weight of it. Just nothing was doing after that.
So all the money in the world and all the engineers and all the people couldn't put Humpty together again.
Yeah.
Wow, that is mad.
That is where the poem came from.